Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in TradFi, digital assets, technology, and financial planning. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the market site, we have Palmina Fava, partner and co-head of government investigations and white-collar defense practice group at Vinson Elkins. We have Jerry Perullo, founder of Adversarial Risk Management, as well as Rae Kelly, head of Cybersecurity Americas at FTI Consulting. We are here to discuss the intersection of cybersecurity, regulation, and disclosures as organizations navigate the complex terrain of cybersecurity compliance in the age of SEC cyber rules. It is great to have everyone with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. Let's go around the horn to kick this off. As we know, the cyberspace has so many different types of roles. We'll start with you, Palmina. What's your role within the ecosystem?
Sure, so we represent clients who are either facing a breach or an incident, security incident, and help them navigate through doing the investigation, remediating, making the disclosure, evaluating the materiality, and then we help also on the flip side in preparing for that, doing tabletop exercises, risk assessment plans, the proactive preparedness, or advising them if a vendor that they work with has been the victim of a breach, and making sure that the steps that they're taking adequately protect our clients.
Right. And Jerry, having one of the first CISO roles in 20 years within the cyberspace at Fortune 500 companies, explain to us what your role is now and sort of have you seen this space evolve?
Sure. So yeah, I wrapped up after 20 years as CISO, as you mentioned, and I began teaching at Georgia Tech. So I'm a professor of the practice in cybersecurity there, where I teach enterprise cybersecurity management. And then I have my startup, Adversarial Risk Management, and we're really targeting growth stage companies that are just hearing and getting hit with all of this cyber need and don't quite want to make the jump into building a whole program. So that's really where we're focused.
Mm-hmm. And Jordan?
Starting at the FBI and its cyber division, working on computer intrusions, and then going to the National Security Council, working on cybersecurity events. Now I'm at FTI Consulting, helping companies navigate the same kind of challenges that Palmina described, whether they've already faced an incident or they're wanting to get ready for one.
Right, and now that they have to comply with certain regulatory standards, what are some of the main considerations that companies can build into proactive material assessments?
I think as we consider materiality, it's really a question of harm and impact in the cybersecurity world. What are going to be the outcomes if something goes wrong? And if something has gone wrong, how do we assess that? So within that world of cybersecurity, we're looking at what's the confidentiality risks, the integrity risks, and the availability risks of data. So we really encourage clients to think about it in those three areas. So has data been exposed that wasn't meant to be made public? Has data been potentially altered in such a way that now you can't trust the integrity of that data? Or now perhaps you just simply can't access your data, so the availability has been affected. So those are really the three key areas that I think are helpful for companies to help define that harm and impact.
Yeah. And on some of that, I mean, many people often just look at it from what's in their electronic database, the financial background, the trade secrets, the secret sauce for how their product is made, but it's also what may power your manufacturing plant. If all of that is accessed through your network system, you may not be able to have your plant running. You may not be able to turn on your computers if that's what you rely upon. So the first step in any kind of risk assessment, any policy evaluation, has to be understanding what's your exposure. It could be in so many different areas. It's not just about payment information or employee data. How will your system go down? How will your company go down if an unauthorized actor gets access?
And Jerry, what is management's role in assessing and managing these risks?
Yeah, I mean, echoing what my co-panelists just mentioned, it really has to be risk-based. And you actually see that reflected in a lot of the regulations. So that's the good news for people, is that things are becoming more principle-based, which was a bit controversial in regulation. Traditionally, cyber, it's a non-negotiable, because the adversaries move so quick that regulation can't be prescriptive. What they would have told you to do 2 years ago won't work anymore. So we do see a lot of things that are more principle-based, and that enables companies to do exactly what they have to, which is analyze the threats, just what Palmina mentioned. Do I need to worry about sabotage, or do I need to be more worried about financial fraud, or I need to be worried about data theft? And once they go through that exercise, then and only then can they narrow down that universe of cyber to the very few things they need to focus on.
Right, and part of the challenge has been, of course, a board has to have oversight of such risks, and we were talking about this off camera, but the role of the CISO in being able to effectively communicate those needs in a language that the board can understand. Clearly, there's a lot of cross currents with the CFO role and CISO role and how risk is managed. We're also seeing more cyber professionals on the makeup of boards. Are they improving in terms of oversight of such risks? Is the education there for them?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot, and it goes both ways. On one hand, there's a big emphasis on bringing directors into the cyber fold and getting them more educated, and I think that's important. We're doing some things at Georgia Tech and professional education towards that front. The other piece that kind of came out as the exhaust of this process is bringing the CISOs into corporate governance. And that's where I talk to a lot of CISOs, and I recommend you need to be training for the boardroom now, and don't feel bad, it's not for your next gig, it's just to speak the language.
Right, and that's the key part, and I was heartened to see some of the 10Ks that have already come out and describe the processes, to see this recognition that you need to have more than the technical piece in the room. The CISO certainly has to be in the room, someone who understands the IT system has to be in the room, because they can talk to how a patch would work, how they're testing and evaluating any anomalous activity. But you need to have the people in the room who are responsible for the business driving forward, so that they can inform the CISO of the various areas in which there would be business risk. And they have to be in the room if there is some incident, because you only have 4 days under the SEC disclosure rules to determine if it's material. And you can't put all of that on the CISO to understand whether that's going to be material and kick in a disclosure obligation.
Yeah, I think now more than ever, it's a shared responsibility. I think the CISO really bore the brunt of it for quite some time. I'm sure you feel that way. But I think now all members of corporate governance, not just boards, but the management, is really understanding that we can't put this on one person, although personal responsibility is certainly an issue that's being widely discussed. But I think there's really a top-down approach to try to get the issues of cybersecurity readiness and cybersecurity compliance right.
Right, I also think as data and the products are available for CISOs to be able to assess risk across all of the different business orgs within the enterprise improving. I mean, that also helps with their job as well, because there's always been that risk that you run into operating in silos and not being able to see the entire risk picture, when you need to be able to, whatever platform you want to call it, be able to look at this in real time and see how each business unit is, where the vulnerabilities are across the org.
I think there's a lot more tooling available, but that doesn't necessarily make it easier. Sometimes I feel like that might even make it more challenging. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to have visibility and insight, but that doesn't mean that companies don't, just by their nature of their structure, sometimes remain siloed, or they'll just go offline and be working in a system that the CISO doesn't even know has been built, and I'm sure you've felt some of those pain points. But I think that the ability to do it is there, but the buy-in really has to come from the top down for everyone to say we're all invested in this issue, in this area.
Yeah, and building on that, there's a wave now of cyber risk quantification efforts to try to get dollar signs behind all this risk. And the jury is still out on that, but I don't think the problem really right now is understanding the dollar value of the risk. I think the problem is the ROI. So people are saying, yeah, I get it, I'm willing to say that's a $250 million risk, but spending $250 million might do nothing. It's just so hard to know that your investment is actually making a difference. It seems so binary sometimes. You might get lucky, or you might just have a catastrophic existential event overnight.
But that's why doing both the tabletop exercises and just having that conversation with the right people in the room is so critically important, because some of that you're going to need to do in order to get cyber insurance, and in order to renew your cyber insurance without having a 350% premium increase on an annual basis. You need to demonstrate that you understand what your risk is, that you've monetized it in some way, and that you've taken the right steps to mitigate that risk. Otherwise, if you're just saying it's a $250 million risk, you're going to be paying a heck of a lot more in an insurance premium than
and it's
if
hard
you
to quantify.
Right.
If nothing goes wrong, how do you show what a good job you did?
Right.
Proving a negative, yeah.
Are these rules going to be enforced with the same rigor that we've seen more traditional financial reporting crimes have?
I think it really remains to be seen, but I do think that there's a little bit of a push-pull in this cybersecurity world of regulation, because we recognize that if companies aren't willing to come forward, when I was in the US government, we talked all the time about we couldn't really help get it right on cybersecurity if people weren't willing to come and say, we've had an incident, we've had a breach. And so there's a push-pull between the regulators and those who are trying to improve the cybersecurity ecosystem in the government to want to have people come forward and not regret coming forward. And so I think that that dynamic will certainly drive what the enforcement really looks like, but even built into the regulation is a little bit of a sense of working with law enforcement is important. We've seen this before in regulation where they say you need to come forward, you need to share information. And so I think that if it's enforced in such a way that people feel like they've been disincentivized from oversharing, that may really drive a behavior that wasn't intended. So I'm really interested to see what that dynamic will be.
And I think too, just looking at the difference between the proposed rules that came out in early 2022 and the final rules that were passed at the end of last year, or became effective at the end of last year, you really see sort of a step back from the SEC saying you must do X, Y, and Z, because it will be different for every company. One size doesn't fit all, and they're always saying that. Don't just take an off-the-shelf policy and change, do a find and replace and put your name in place of somebody else's, because that's not necessarily what's going to work for you. That doesn't assess your risk. And so then saying to a company after there has been a breach, when also the push has been in that push-pull analysis, you will be the victim at some point. It's not you may never find yourself in this situation. It's when you do, be prepared and be able to minimize it as much as possible. So it'd be really hard then for the SEC to come down and say, well, you didn't do this in the same way that XYZ company did, if what you did followed a risk assessment and was reasonable at the time that you implemented it.
Do you think they understand that a one-size-fits policy all is not the appropriate strategy?
Well, I do. So in the proposed rules, it actually mentioned companies disclosing their policies and procedures. And I think that would have been a really bad outcome, because every company right here in New York, even if you went one-to-one, has a totally different interpretation of what policies is. Sometimes it's marketing documentation, and sometimes it's really technical instructions. And if you look at the back and forth with the comments, and I was involved in that process myself, they ultimately back down to processes. So describe your processes, and because it is more principle-based, those processes aren't just what firewalls you have, but rather what's your risk assessment process. And I think there's adequate room in there, especially for smaller companies, to go through that and intentionally and deliberately spell out and exercise and test and say, we do not have a huge cyber risk, and we're making a prudent but more modest investment in cyber. And I'm glad that that opportunity exists, because speaking of one size fits all, not everyone has to spend half of their OpEx on cybersecurity.
Right. And I think we have other laws that have been on the books and enforced for a number of years that also have this compliance program component. Dodd-Frank required a risk assessment and an analysis. The FCPA pilot programs that the DOJ and the SEC examine include giving credit if there are compliance programs that are in place and evaluating your compliance programs, recognizing that it's not going to be the same for everybody. So there is some look back that you have. There is some precedent setting for everybody adopting a policy that makes the most sense, provided they've undertaken that first step of doing that risk assessment.
Yeah, I mean, every industry is regulated different too. I mean, even at the baseline. So, I mean, especially financial services, which we have played in, one of the most highly regulated businesses. Jordan, how can companies work with the FBI prior to experiencing an incident?
Well, I say all the time to figure out who your right point of contact at the FBI is not when you've already had an incident, right? It's really important to figure that out in advance. And then not just to know who you should be working with in government, but also what your company is going to be willing to share with government. And that's something you should be exercising and discussing before, because there are differing views in management of how open they want to be when they have that incident and they decide they need to share information. And there are other players from the government space who, when you've had an incident, want to come in and say, what can you make available to me? So I think the most important thing is to plan and prepare in advance, just establish those points of contact, and then have discussions about what you want to share, which you often do through a tabletop exercise. You're practicing and you're saying, okay, who is going to be the person that calls the FBI or CISA or our regulators? And really putting that into your incident response plan can make so much difference when an incident actually does happen.
Not it.
Not it. You don't want to be drinking from the fire hose and making those decisions, because you may make some bad choices.
Are there data privacy implications around this as well, in terms of what they can request and what companies are willing to give up?
Yeah, in some ways, it's less about the data privacy, unless you're talking about certain healthcare information that we're highly sensitive personal information. But the government can ask for it, can ask the types of information that was shared. It's not, the government won't necessarily ask for that information itself unless you want the government's assistance in evaluating whether any of that information's been published on the dark web. That may be a way to facilitate identifying if the threat actor has already published that information. But if highly sensitive or personal identifiable information that's regulated by state or international data privacy laws has been accessed, you have a slew of other legislation that would require a disclosure to other regulators. And then once you are disclosing that breach to those other regulators, even if you've determined that it's not material and doesn't necessarily trigger your SEC disclosure obligations, that's an analysis that should be happening too. If you're already telling the Attorney General California about a breach because it affected a triggering number of employees in California, then do you also tell the SEC?
Right. Are bad actors actually caught? Are there any repercussions for what's happening? You have all these mitigation efforts, and of course companies, enterprises, now they have to work with regulators, FBI, SEC, and disclose and show a constructive plan. Are we learning anything from this? Are we catching bad actors? Are we prosecuting them? Like what's the good part of the story?
I would argue that there have been some wins there. There's also a whole lot of indictments that'll never actually see the light of day because it's outside of extradition, right? As a matter of fact, a lot of people try to define travel policies and they try to figure out what are high-risk countries, and we ultimately concluded it's countries that don't have an extradition treaty with yours. Right, and it's not necessarily that the governments of those countries are perpetrating the crimes. It's that anyone who's going to do something bad will either be in one of those countries or they'll relay all their traffic through it so that the subpoenas won't even work to figure out where they're coming from. That said, sometimes you see it all the time, actually. Indictments with photos of people, but unless they step foot on U.S. soil, they're not necessarily going to be brought to justice. And it just depends on the threat objective, though. And there's some crimes that are being perpetrated by people that are masquerading, and then you have others that are domestic that either can be clawed back or funds can be traced, and you do see people actually serving time for cybercrime now.
And you can intercept the payment if it's done. If you've reached out to the FBI early enough, you can at least intercept the payment, block it from being processed.
Oftentimes.
But some of it is a matter of also just, can you leverage, if it's a state actor, if the threat actor is a nation state, how will that then factor into and be leveraged by government agencies in other foreign policy initiatives that they need? So it's good to know, it's good to identify who those threat actors are, it's good to be able to create all of those touch points, because they may never face justice in the way that we may traditionally be thinking about it, but that doesn't mean that there won't be some public policy reason and foreign policy initiative that could be advanced.
And the intelligence that's gained from these investigations does help in deterrence.
Absolutely.
And I do think that the law enforcement actions are a deterrent effect on these actors in countries who might be highly technical, highly sophisticated, and now they have a list of countries they can't travel to. And so we always hope that there's a combination of all of these different approaches, that it's driving it down, but at the minimum we want to investigate all we can so we can glean the maximum amount of intelligence so that we can apply that in our defenses.
It seems like there's so much happening within technology and within cybersecurity. It's moving so fast.
Yeah.
I mean, by the time you think you've caught up with something, there's an AI, we were talking about this off camera, AI, helpful for bad actors, but then it's also helpful in terms of mitigating or having these controls in place.
Sure.
Yeah, I think you really hit it on the head there. And like any discipline, you try to look for metaphors and things that have already been proven. And so what we would always do is look at risk management, not cyber risk management, but risk management around for hundreds of years. And there are things you can learn, but where's the delta? Why is it different? And the conclusion is it's the presence of the adversary, right? Hence adversarial risk management. The idea is that someone's constantly pivoting, and that's not true with a storm, right? Or some kind of threat like that. So agility is really the key, and one of the key metrics that we measure for a company and we try to help them improve is what we call remediation agility. And we spent in big business so many years freezing things and not making changes because we know how disruptive it can be in IT to make the tiniest change. And now we're in an environment where we have to make a change now to respond to an adversary. And striking that balance is certainly challenging.
Yeah, those annoying 90-day password resets. All right, in the last couple of minutes here, Palmina, any final thoughts?
I think one of those pieces about AI where it can be really useful is more and more you're going to see that this has to be automated. The risk mitigation, the auditing that needs to happen on a regular basis in order to identify these issues, you're going to be most effective if you can automate that. And there are various AI tools. I mean, now AI's become this buzzword and everybody immediately thinks of generative AI and chatbots. But it's not just about that. It's about all of the different ways that you can aggregate different pieces of data to help you automate the process of monitoring, which is what trips everybody up. It's easy to put policies in place, but then figuring out how you're going to monitor the effectiveness of that policy, how you're going to evaluate any anomalous activity, who's going to do that, how regularly they're going to do that, that's where AI can really advance the business.
And Jordan, final thoughts?
I think that businesses know they can't ignore cybersecurity anymore. And so this SEC rules are really just a drop in the bucket of many regulations, and companies know they need to take this seriously. And I think many of them already are and have, and I'm excited to see how more regulations will continue to come to drive behaviors.
All right, we appreciate the insight, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.